Judge laughs at Clint Eastwood in court, then freezes when he flashes his US badge. Before we dive in, kindly hit the subscribe button. And let us know where you're watching from in the comments. The wooden gavel came down with a sharp crack, and the murmur of the small Wyoming courtroom died instantly. Judge Robert Willis, a man of average height and considerable girth, adjusted his glasses as he scanned the paperwork before him. The room filled with a handful of locals and county officials felt more like a town hall meeting than a place of law. The case at hand was nothing more than a routine zoning dispute, and the judge had already decided it wasn't going to take up much of his time. Seated at the defendant's table was Clint Eastwood, looking every bit the legend that time had refused to fully break. His lined face bore the scars of a life lived hard, and his pale blue eyes held the kind of intensity that didn't need raising a voice to command attention. Dressed in a worn leather jacket and jeans, he looked like a man who had been dragged into this court against his better judgment. Judge Willis cleared his throat. Mr. Eastwood, it says here that your guest house on the northern edge of your property exceeds the size limitations set forth by the Jackson County zoning laws. As such, the county is within its rights to require that it be brought into compliance or removed. He glanced up, barely concealing a smirk. I assume you'd like to make a case for keeping it. Eastwood leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. His voice, though growly with age, carried effortlessly through the room. I built that place with my own hands. It's not bothering anybody, and I sure as hell don't take kindly to the government telling me what I can and can't do on my own land. A few chuckles rippled through the gallery, but the judge simply shook his head. Mr. Eastwood, the law applies to everyone, even if you have a few movies under your belt. More laughter followed, but Eastwood didn't so much as blink. He let the room have its moment, let them enjoy the idea that they had an aging actor standing before them pleading his case like any other citizen. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached into his jacket. The bailiff took a half step forward, his hand twitching near his holster. But Eastwood didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he produced a small silver badge, placing it flat on the table where the overhead lights caught the lettering. The laughter stopped. Judge Willis squinted at it, his smirk faltering. What the hell is that supposed to be? Eastwood leaned back, crossing his arms. That, Your Honor, is a United States Secret Service badge, and it means I've had to enforce a lot more than zoning laws in my time. The judge's expression changed immediately. The color drained from his face, and his fingers twitched slightly as he adjusted his glasses for a closer look. He wasn't a fool. He knew what he was staring at. The badge was authentic, the kind issued only to men who had served in the darkest, most classified corners of national security. For a moment, there was silence. Then Judge Willis cleared his throat. Mr. Eastwood, are you telling me you were a lot more than an actor? Eastwood interrupted, his voice quiet but firm, and a lot more than what's in your case file. Willis licked his lips. The weight of what he had just learned settled on his chest like a lead brick. There had been whispers over the years, rumors that some of Hollywood's most legendary figures had pasts that weren't meant to be discussed, but this was something else entirely. He glanced at the bailiff, who looked just as stunned as he felt. The spectators in the room had stopped fidgeting, their casual amusement now replaced with an uneasy curiosity. Willis shifted in his seat. Mr. Eastwood, what exactly are you doing here in Wyoming? Eastwood smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in it. Just trying to live a quiet life, Your Honor. The judge studied him carefully, now understanding that the man before him wasn't just some Hollywood relic fighting over a property line. He was something else entirely, and suddenly a simple zoning dispute didn't seem so simple anymore. Judge Willis sat stiffly in his chair, his mind struggling to reconcile what he had just seen. The weight of the courtroom had shifted, as if gravity itself had changed with the revelation of Clint Eastwood's past. The badge still sat on the table, gleaming under the overhead lights. It wasn't a prop, wasn't some relic from a film set. It was real, more than that. It was official. He looked up at Eastwood, who sat as still as a statue, his sharp blue eyes locked onto him, waiting. The judge felt a bead of sweat forming at his temple. He had never been an easily rattled man, but something about this moment felt different. Mr. Eastwood, Willis said carefully, clearing his throat, I wasn't aware of your affiliations. Eastwood smirked slow and measured. Not many were. The judge picked up the badge, turning it over in his hands. It had weight to it, the kind of heft that came with real authority. He had seen Secret Service badges before, but this one was different. The number, the insignia, it wasn't the standard issue of a field agent or a security detail. This was something else entirely. Finally, he set it down, exhaling. I assume this means your role in government service wasn't exactly public knowledge. Eastwood leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. You could say that the judge studied him, feeling a strange mixture of curiosity and unease. I'll admit, I've heard rumors over the years about certain people with pasts that weren't meant to be discussed. But I just figured you were an actor who happened to play tough guys on screen. Eastwood chuckled. But there was no humor in it. You think it's easy playing tough guys? You think I just read a script and pretended Willis hesitated. I guess I never thought about it. That way most people don't. Eastwood sat back in his chair tapping his fingers on. The table truth is I was good at two things. Acting and getting my hands dirty, one of those things paid better, but the other one that was a duty. The room was silent, now the air thick with the weight of unspoken things. Willis shifted in his chair. So what does that mean for this case? Because I have to tell you, Mr. Eastwood, as much as I respect whatever you've done in the past, it doesn't change the fact that the zoning laws are in place for a reason. Eastwood nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. And I'm not asking for a favor, I'm asking for understanding. Willis raised an eyebrow. Understanding? Eastwood's voice dropped, the growly timbre deepening that. Guest house isn't just a guest house, it's a safe house. Willis blinked. What a safe house? Eastwood repeated. You ever hear of Blackthorn? The judge frowned, the name unfamiliar. Should I have? Eastwood smirked, but his eyes remained cold. No, that's the whole point. Willis drummed his fingers on the bench, his legal mind trying to piece things together. All right, let's say I believe you. Let's say that your guest house has some kind of national security purpose. Why not just go through official channels? Why fight this in open court? Eastwood's face darkened. Because the people who should be protecting me are the ones trying to erase me. Willis felt a chill run through him. Erase you? Eastwood nodded. Old programs have a way of coming back to haunt the people who ran them. Blackthorn was one of those programs. It was never supposed to exist. But when you work in the shadows long enough, you learn that nothing ever really stays buried. Someone wants to clean the slate, and I have a feeling that if I let them take down that safe house, it won't be long before they come for me next. The judge swallowed hard. This was no longer about a simple property dispute. It was about something much bigger, something that went far beyond Jackson, Wyoming. He glanced toward the door, half expecting men in suits to come bursting in at any second. Mr. Eastwood, you're asking me to ignore zoning laws based on something I have no proof of. Eastwood sighed, rubbing his fingers together in thought. I get it, Judge. You've got a job to do. But you have to understand, this isn't just about my property, it's about what's coming next. You don't know it yet, but you're standing on the edge of something big, something dangerous. Willis frowned. And what exactly is coming next? Eastwood leaned in his voice a whisper. A war, one that's been waiting a long time to start. The judge stared at him, the words settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had walked into his courtroom today, expecting a simple case, a routine decision about a guest house that was too large for county standards. Now he was staring into the eyes of a man who had lived more lives than anyone knew, a man who was warning him about a conflict that wasn't in any history book, and for the first time in his career, Judge Willis wasn't sure if he was going to make it home in one piece. Judge Robert Willis sat frozen in his chair, the weight of Clint Eastwood's words pressing down on him like a lead anchor. His courtroom was supposed to be a place of order, a refuge for law and logic. But now, with a man like Eastwood sitting before him, it felt more like the opening scene of something far bigger, something he wasn't prepared for. Outside, the Wyoming sun had begun to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows through the windows. The quiet murmurs of the few remaining courtroom observers had faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. The judge licked his lips, gathering his composure. Mr. Eastwood, I don't take kindly to threats in my courtroom. Eastwood didn't didn't even blink. That was a threat, Your Honor, he said, his voice calm but firm. It was a warning. Willis exhaled slowly, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. So you expect me to believe that a simple zoning dispute is actually part of some larger conspiracy, that your property is a, what did you call it, a safe house? Eastwood smirked. You're catching on. The judge scoffed. I don't have time for this. The law is the law, and your past, whatever it is, doesn't change that. Eastwood studied him carefully. You don't know what you're stepping into. Judge Willis shook his head, tired of the cryptic games. Then why don't you enlighten me? Who exactly is coming after you? Eastwood exhaled through his nose, tapping his fingers lightly on the table. There was a time when men like me weren't just assets. We were the insurance policy. Blackthorn wasn't a program you joined, it was one you were chosen for. And once you were in, there was no getting out. Willis narrowed his eyes. Sounds more like a death squad than a government operation. Eastwood chuckled darkly. You're smarter than you look. The judge folded his arms. Then let me guess, something changed, something went wrong. Eastwood nodded. Blackthorn was buried officially, but unofficially it went private. The same men who trained us started selling their skills to the highest bidder countries, corporations, people with money and power, but no conscience. Willis leaned forward, his legal instincts kicking in, and now someone's trying to clean house, erase the path. Eastwood nodded. Exactly. And if my name's still on their list, it means I'm not the only one left alive. A knock at the side door made Willis jump slightly. The bailiff entered, leaning down to whisper something in the judge's ear. Sir, there's a federal agent here. Says it's urgent. Willis stiffened. He looked at Eastwood, who remained unfazed, then back at the BFF. What agency? Homeland Security. The BFF murmured. He said you'd want to hear what he has to say. The judge hesitated. A federal Agent showing up in the middle of a routine zoning case was anything but normal. Eastwood smirked, told you, "Judge, you're already in deeper than you think." Willis exhaled, then nodded at the BFF. "Fine. Let him in." The BFF disappeared through the side door. Moments later it swung open again, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. He was in his early 40s, sharp-eyed, and moved with the quiet confidence of someone used to being in control. "Judge Willis," the man said, flashing a badge. "Special Agent Mark, Helton, Department of Homeland Security." Willis eyed him cautiously. "I assume this isn't a coincidence." Ton shook his head. "I'm afraid not." He turned his gaze to Eastwood. "Mr. Eastwood, been a long time." Eastwood nodded slightly. "Not long enough." Helton sighed, stepping forward. "Judge, I'm going to need you to clear the room." Willis glanced around the remaining spectators, and clerks were already looking uneasy, sensing something bigger unfolding before them. He tapped his gavel once. "Clear the courtroom now." The room emptied in minutes, leaving only Eastwood, Willis, and Agent Helton. Helton turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, you need to understand something. Clint Eastwood isn't just an actor. He isn't just a former operative. He's a man who was part of something that never should have existed. And if he's flashing that badge in your courtroom, it means something's very wrong." Willis folded his arms, his mind racing. "Why don't you cut the cryptic talk and tell me exactly what's happening?" Helton hesitated, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder. He handed it to Willis. "This is what you're dealing with." Willis opened the folder, his eyes widening as he flipped through grainy surveillance photos. Some were old, taken in the shadows of history, showing Eastwood alongside men whose names had long since faded into classified files. Others were newer satellite images and intelligence reports. One showed a burned-out compound in Eastern Europe. Another depicted bodies in the snow lined up like discarded chess pieces. The final page held a name: Logan Pierce. Willis looked up. "Who the hell is Logan Pierce?" Helton exhaled. "The man who's cleaning up Blackthorn. And if he knows Eastwood is still alive, it means your courtroom just became the front line of a war you never knew existed." The judge swallowed hard. His simple zoning case had just turned into something far more dangerous. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the truth. The walls of Judge Robert Willis's chambers felt smaller than usual, as if the weight of the conversation pressing down on the room was enough to shrink the very space they occupied. The moment Special Agent Mark Helton handed him the folder, Willis knew that he was no longer just a small-town judge handling minor disputes. He was now part of something much bigger and far deadlier than he had ever imagined. He flipped through the pages, his stomach tightening with every photograph, every classified document. The black and white images of Clint Eastwood standing beside high-ranking military officials, intelligence officers, and even a former president were damning enough. But it was the last few pages that made his blood run cold. "Logan Pierce," Willis murmured, reading the name aloud. He glanced up at Helton. "Who is he?" Helton sighed, running a hand over his clean-shaven jaw. "Pierce was a ghost, just like Eastwood, a top-tier operative recruited into Blackthorn when it was still under the umbrella of unofficial government business. He was one of the best until he wasn't. Something changed. We don't know if it was greed, ideology, or something personal, but when Blackthorn was officially dismantled, Pierce didn't disappear like the others. He went private." Willis frowned. "Private? You mean mercenary work?" Helton nodded grimly. "Worse, he built an empire out of selling classified intelligence and high-end contract work, political assassinations, corporate warfare, covert destabilization. You name it, he's done it. And now, for reasons we don't fully understand, yet he's erasing Blackthorn's history, starting with the people who were part of it." Willis glanced at Eastwood, who had remained silent through most of the exchange. He sat in his chair, arms crossed, unreadable. Finally, the judge turned back to Helton. "And you think Eastwood is on that list?" Ton chuckled dryly. "Judge Eastwood isn't just on the list, he's at the top of it." Willis exhaled sharply and rubbed his temples. "Jesus Christ." Eastwood finally spoke, his voice as steady as ever. "Why now?" Helton glanced at him. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Blackthorn was buried deep. There was no reason to dig it up." Unless he hesitated, then leaned against the desk. "Unless someone is trying to reclaim it." Willis frowned. "Reclaim it? You mean restart the program?" Ton nodded. "Think about it. Blackthorn was one of the most effective, albeit illegal, covert operations in modern history. No bureaucracy, no oversight, just highly trained operatives eliminating threats before they even became threats. If someone wanted to bring that back under private control, the first thing they'd need to do is eliminate anyone who could expose them." Willis looked at Eastwood. "And that's why you built that safe house?" Eastwood smirked slightly. "I always knew the pass might come knocking, just didn't expect it to come with this much firepower." The judge let out a dry chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "So what now? You expecting me to just drop the zoning case and pretend none of this happened?" Helton shook his head. "I don't care about the zoning dispute, Judge. But if you throw Eastwood under the bus, you're giving Pierce exactly what he wants. He's watching. He has ears in places you wouldn't expect if this court rules against Eastwood and forces him to vacate that property, it'll make him vulnerable. And that's when they'll strike Willis' side. He had spent his life believing in the law and rules and order. But this was something else entirely. He glanced between the two men. And what happens if I play along, if I let him keep his so-called safe house? Eastwood answered first. Then you live a little longer. Willis narrowed his eyes, that supposed to be reassuring. Eastwood gave him a slow, measured look. It's supposed to be the truth. The judge leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers on the desk. I have half a mind to recuse myself from this case altogether. Helton's face darkened. That won't help if you step away. Now someone else will take over, someone who won't have the benefit of this conversation. And if they rule against Eastwood, this whole town could become a battleground. Before the week is out, Willis swallowed hard. He had never been a man to shy away from difficult decisions, but this wasn't just difficult, it was terrifying. Finally, he exhaled. All right, he said, voice quieter than before. Let's say I don't throw Eastwood to the wolves. What's stopping them from coming after me next? Ton exchanged a glance with Eastwood. Before replying, nothing. Willis felt his stomach tighten. Eastwood leaned forward. The difference is now you know they're coming. That means you can prepare. Willis let out a slow, shaky breath. And if I say no? Eastwood didn't answer. Ton did. Then you'll be the next name on the list, Judge. And no one will ever know why. Silence filled the chamber. Willis glanced down at the folder, at the images of dead men, of places that no longer existed, of an organization that had been erased from history. For the first time in his life, he realized the law wouldn't protect him. And for the first time in his life, he was afraid. The sun had nearly set by the time Judge Robert Willis pulled into his driveway. The long, winding road leading to his modest Wyoming home was usually a source of comfort, a retreat from the stress of courtrooms and paperwork. But tonight it felt exposed, vulnerable. As he cut the engine and stepped out, the crisp mountain air did little to calm his nerves. The events of the day replayed in his mind like a bad dream. Clint Eastwood wasn't just some aging Hollywood legend fighting a petty zoning dispute. He was a man with a past so dark and classified that the federal government had long since buried it. And now someone was unearthing it piece by piece, starting with the men who had lived it, and somehow he had stumbled right into the middle of it. A voice cut through the silence. Just Willis jumped, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned to see Eastwood leaning against the side of his porch, arms crossed the brim of his weathered hat, casting a shadow over his eyes. The old man looked as if he had been there for hours waiting. Damn it, Eastwood, Willis muttered, clutching his chest. You trying to give me a heart attack? Eastwood smirked. If that scared you, Judge, you're not ready for what's coming next. Willis let out a slow breath, rubbing his temples. I should arrest you for trespassing. You could try, Eastwood said, pushing off the porch and stepping closer. But right now I'm the only thing standing between you and the people who'd rather see you 6 feet under. The judge studied him carefully. That's supposed to make me feel better? Eastwood's smirk faded. No, it's supposed to make you listen. Willis sighed and motioned toward the house. Fine, come inside. But if you're going to drop another bombshell on me, at least let me have a drink first. Inside, Willis poured himself a stiff glass of whiskey and gestured toward Eastwood, who shook his head. Never drink when I'm expecting trouble, Eastwood said, settling into a chair. That a habit from your other career? Willis asked, taking a long sip. Eastwood nodded. Leighton just say it's kept me alive longer than most. Willis exhaled and leaned against the counter. All right, Clint, start talking. You've already made it clear that this whole thing is bigger than a zoning dispute. And after what Helton showed me today, I'm inclined to leave you. But what I don't get is why now? Why Wyoming? Why me? Eastwood drummed his fingers on the armrest of his chair, thinking Blackthorn was buried for a reason too dangerous, too unpredictable, the kind of program that made enemies someone wants it back, and they're willing to kill to make sure the people who ran it, people like me, aren't around to stop them. Willis set his glass down. Okay, but where do I fit into this? Eastwood's eyes flicked up sharp as ever. Because you made a mistake, Judge. You laughed at the wrong man in the wrong courtroom, that told them you didn't know who I was, and that made you the perfect pawn. Willis frowned. Pawn for what? Eastwood leaned forward, his voice quieter now. Pierce's testing me. He wanted to see how I'd react, see if I'd fight back or lie down and die. He's watching, listening, and if I had just rolled over and accepted your ruling, he'd know I was weak. Willis let out a dry laugh. And instead I'm now caught in some covert war I didn't even know existed. That about sums it up, Eastwood said. The judge rubbed his face. Jesus Christ, what the hell do I do now? Eastwood stood, adjusting his jacket. For now, keep your doors locked, Judge. Keep your windows covered, and if you see something that doesn't feel right, trust your gut, and don't hesitate. Willis swallowed hard. That bad? Eastwood gave him a long look. Worse, a tense silence settled over the room. Willis felt the weight of it pressing on his chest. Then from outside, a sudden click. Eastwood moved before Willis even had time to process it. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the judge and yanked him to the ground just as the front window exploded. Glass rained down as a bullet buried itself into the wall behind them. Willis's Ears rang from the sudden impact. His breath came fast and shallow. What the hell? Eastwood was already moving. He rolled to the side, drawing a pistol from inside his jacket. He peered through the shattered window, scanning the darkened landscape. Beyond, another shot rang out, hitting the floor just inches from Willis's outstretched hand. He scrambled back, heart pounding. Stay down, Eastwood barked. The judge barely had time to comply before Eastwood returned fire. 3 shots. Precise, controlled. A moment of silence, then the distant sound of a car engine roaring to life. Tires screeched against the pavement as whoever had taken the shots peeled away into the night. Eastwood kept his gun raised, waiting, listening. Nothing. Slowly, he exhaled and lowered the weapon. He turned to Willis, who was still sitting on the floor, wide-eyed and breathing heavily. Judge, Eastwood said, tucking the gun back into his jacket. Welcome to Blackthorn. Willis looked around his shattered living room, his mind racing. Just hours ago, he had been a simple judge handling a simple case. Now he was ducking bullets from unseen enemies. He ran a hand through his hair, swallowing hard. Jesus, Clint, what the hell did I just get myself into? Eastwood smirked, but there was no humor in it. The fight of your life, Your Honor. Willis stared at the broken window, at the hole in his wall, at the bullet casing that had rolled onto the hardwood floor. For the first time in his life, he felt truly powerless, and for the first time in his life, he understood exactly what fear felt like. Judge Robert Willis hadn't moved from his spot on the floor. His ears still rang from the gunshots, his breathing uneven. The bullet hole in his living room wall was real. The shattered window, the cold wind blowing in from outside, it was all real, and that meant everything Clint Eastwood had told him was real too. Eastwood remained on his feet, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp as ever. He scanned the darkened landscape outside the broken window, watching. Waiting, his gun was still in his hand, the barrel steady. He hadn't even flinched when the bullets came. Willis swallowed hard. Clint, tell me you know who the hell that was? Eastwood didn't take his eyes off the outside. If I had to guess, someone working for Pierce. Could be local muscle, could be professionals. He turned back to Willis. Either way, it means we just ran out of time. Willis rubbed his face, his hands shaking slightly. Jesus, you were right, they really are coming after you, and now they know you're involved. Eastwood added, you're officially a loose-end judge. That means they'll be back. The words settled in Willis's gut like a stone. He had always lived his life by the law, believing in the power of rules and order. But this wasn't about laws, this wasn't even about justice, this was survival. He forced himself to his feet, his knees feeling weak beneath him. All right, so what the hell do we do now? Eastwood holstered his gun and walked to the shattered window, peering out into the darkness. We move now. Willis frowned. Move, where someplace they won't expect, Eastwood said, already moving toward the door. Someplace safe. Willis let out a dry chuckle. Safe? I'm guessing that place doesn't exist anymore. Eastwood gave him a sideways glance. Oh, it exists, but getting there won't be easy. The judge hesitated. He wasn't used to this. He was used to being in control, to having the power to dictate outcomes from the bench. But now he was just another man running for his life. He exhaled sharply. All right, Leighton, go. Eastwood nodded, stepping outside first, scanning the street. The night was quiet, too quiet. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air. Willis followed him, locking the door behind him, even though he knew it wouldn't stop anyone determined enough to come inside. Where are we headed? Eastwood didn't answer immediately. He walked to an old pickup truck parked at the edge of the driveway and popped open the glove compartment. Inside, Willis caught a glimpse of several items, a spare pistol, extra ammunition, and something that looked suspiciously like an encrypted phone. Finally, Eastwood turned to him. Utah, Salt Lake City. Willis blinked. Utah? What the hell is in Utah? Eastwood handed him a slip of paper. A man named Joseph Tanner. If he's still alive, he'll have answers. The name was unfamiliar, but then again, everything about this situation was outside Willis's expertise. He glanced at Eastwood. And if he's not alive? Eastwood smirked. Then we already too late. The drive was long, silent, and tense. Eastwood drove with the kind of focus that suggested he had done this before many times. His hands were steady on the wheel, his eyes constantly scanning the road, the mirrors, the passing headlights of other cars. Willis, on the other hand, was trying to keep himself together. The whiskey he had downed earlier had long since burned away, leaving only the pounding headache of reality. Finally, after nearly an hour of silence, Willis spoke. Tell me about this Tanner guy. Eastwood didn't take his eyes off the road. Joseph Tanner was one of the best surveillance infiltration cleanup. He was the guy they sent in when they wanted something or someone to disappear without a trace. Willis shifted uncomfortably in his seat. And you trust him? Eastwood chuckled dryly. I don't trust anyone, Judge. But I do know that if Tanner's still breathing, Hune's probably got eyes on us already. Willis frowned. What do you mean? Eastwood tapped the dashboard. Blackthorn operatives don't get caught off guard. If he's still alive, he already knows we're coming. That didn't sit well with Willis. Then why go to him at all? Because Eastwood said, his tone flat. HEK the Only man left who might know what Pierce is planning. Willis sighed, rubbing his temples. I can't believe I'm involved in this. I'm a judge. Clint, not a soldier. Eastwood glanced at him, breathing. Aren't you? Willis narrowed his eyes. What the hell is that supposed to mean? Eastwood smirked. It means you're in the fight, whether you like it or not. The judge exhaled sharply, shaking his head. This is insane. Yesterday, I was worried about property lines. Now I'm on the run with a former government assassin. Eastwood's smirk faded. You think this is just about me, about Blackthorn? Judge, you don't know how deep this goes. Pierce isn't just cleaning up the past, he's setting the stage for something else, something bigger. Willis frowned like what? Eastwood tightened his grip on the wheel. That's what we're about to find out. Miles behind them, a black SUV cruised down the same highway, keeping its distance. Inside, a man in a dark suit watched the tail lights of Eastwood's truck through tinted windows. He picked up a phone, pressing a single button. They're moving, he said, his voice calm, professional. The response came almost immediately, a cold voice on the other end. Do we take them now? A pause. No, the man said, let them run, it'll be easier that way. He hung up, staring out at the open road ahead. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The highway stretched ahead of them, an endless ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Utah desert. The air outside was thick with the kind of silence that only existed in the deep hours of the night, where the world seemed to pause, waiting for something to happen. Inside Clint Eastwood's truck, Judge Robert Willis was beginning to understand something terrifying. There was no going back. His life had changed in the span of a single courtroom session. He had gone from ruling on zoning disputes to dodging bullets in his own home, from believing in the power of the law to realizing that there were men who lived far beyond its reach. Clint Eastwood was one of those men, and now, by sheer bad luck, so is he. The Wyoming mountains had long since faded behind them, and Salt Lake City loomed ahead in the distance, a collection of twinkling lights at the base of the Wasatch Range. But despite the promise of civilization, Willis had never felt more exposed. He glanced over at Eastwood, who hadn't said much since they left his house. The old man drove with the steady, practiced precision of someone who had done this too many times. Before his eyes flicked between the road ahead, the rearview mirror, and the horizon, scanning for threats. Willis sighed. Tell me something, Clint. How the hell did you get into this life? Eastwood smirked. But he didn't take his eyes off the road. You really want to know? Not sure, but since I apparently don't have a choice anymore, I might as well learn what kind of mess I'm in. Eastwood was quiet for a long moment before speaking. I was recruited, young special projects, the kind of work that never made it into history books. Blackthorn didn't have ranks. Didn't have titles, we were just men who got things done. No one knew our names. And that's the way it was supposed to be. Willis swallowed hard. But people did know your name. Eastwood chuckled. Yeah, that's what made me useful. Who would ever suspect a Hollywood actor was running operations on the side? The judge shook his head. So all these years you were what? A ghost, Eastwood repeated. But ghosts don't stay buried forever. Someone always wants to dig them up. Willis exhaled, staring at the road ahead. And now Pierce is the one digging. Looks like it, Eastwood said. Willis rubbed his temples. And this Tanner guy, he's going to help us? Eastwood smirked. Tanner doesn't help people, he survives. And right now, if he's still alive, he knows we're coming. That means one of two things. Either he's ready to talk, or he's already packed up and disappeared. Willis frowned. And if it's the second option, Eastwood's grip on the wheel tightened, then we're running out of time. They reached Salt Lake City just before dawn, pulling into a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The houses here were modest, old, but well-kept, the kind of place where people left their porch lights on at night and still trusted their neighbors. Eastwood slowed the truck as they approached a single-story house at the end of a cul-de-sac. The blinds were drawn, the porch light was off. Willis frowned. You sure this is the place? Eastwood nodded. Tanner always liked to keep things low-key. They sat in the truck for a moment, both men watching the house in silence. Finally, Eastwood unbuckled his seat belt. Stay here, Willis scoffed. Like hell, I'm not just going to sit here while you go knocking on the door of a trained killer. Eastwood gave him a sideways glance. Suit yourself. They stepped out of the truck, moving cautiously up the walkway. Eastwood knocked twice, firm, but not aggressive. No answer. He knocked again, still nothing. Willis shifted uneasily. Maybe he's not home. Eastwood shook his head. Hune's home. Willis frowned. How do you? A click sounded from behind them. Hands where I can see them. Willis's breath caught in his throat. The voice was quiet, controlled, and unmistakably dangerous. Eastwood, to his credit, didn't even flinch. Hello, Tanner. Slowly, they turned. Standing in the driveway was a man in his 60s, wiry, but strong, with sharp green eyes that never stopped moving. He held a shotgun at hip level, relaxed but ready. Clint. Tanner said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much. You've got some damn nerve showing up here. Eastwood smirked. That's what people keep telling me. Tanner's eyes flicked to Willis. And who's the suit? Judge Robert Willis. Eastwood said he got pulled into this by accident. Tanner let out a dry chuckle. Bad luck, Judge. Real bad luck. Willis exhaled. Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out. Tanner studied them both for a moment, then sighed. Fine, get inside. But if this is a setup, I put you both in the ground." Eastwood smirked. "You can try the inside of Tanner's home," was exactly what Willis had expected, practically bare, no family photos, no personal touches, just a couch, a table, and a few chairs. The walls were plain, the windows double-shielded. This wasn't a home, it was a hideout. Tanner set the shotgun down on the table and poured himself a drink. "So, Clint, you going to tell me why the hell you're here?" Eastwood sat down, resting his elbows on his knees, Blackthorn's back. Tanner's face twitched slightly, but he didn't react. Otherwise, he took a slow sip of his drink before answering, "That's not funny, Clint, not a joke." Eastwood said, "Someone's tying up loose ends. I'm still breathing, which means they're still hunting." Tanner exhaled through his nose, shaking his head. "Damn it, I should have seen this coming a few weeks ago. I noticed some unusual activity, encrypted messages bouncing around old channels, thought it was just noise. But now." He turned to Eastwood. "You're sure they're hunting us?" Eastwood nodded. "Took a couple of shots at the judge last night." Tanner whistled. "Hell of a way to get introduced to the game." Willis folded his arms. "I don't consider being shot at part of any game." Tanner smirked. "Then you'd better learn quick, Your Honor, because you're in it now." The room went quiet. Finally, Eastwood spoke. "Pierce is the one pulling the strings, isn't he?" Tanner didn't answer right away. He took another sip of his drink, then set the glass down. "Yeah. And if he knows we're talking right now, we don't have much time." A sudden noise outside, gravel crunching under tires. Tanner's expression darkened. "Damn it, too late." Eastwood moved first, grabbing his gun. "They found us." Willis felt his stomach drop. "Jesus, what do we do?" T chambered around in his shotgun. "We fight outside." Black SUVs rolled to a stop. The doors opened. Men in tactical gear stepped out, their weapons drawn. The hunt had just become a war. The silence before the storm stretched thin, charged with a tension so thick it felt suffocating outside. The SUVs had come to a complete stop, their tinted windows reflecting the dim light from the street lamp. The engines hummed quietly, idling like predators, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Inside the house, Clint Eastwood moved like a man who had done this before, too many times to count. His gun was already in his hand, held low but ready. He glanced at Tanner, who had positioned himself near the front window, shotgun pressed against his shoulder. Judge Robert Willis, on the other hand, was frozen, his heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming shallow and uneven. He had spent years in courtrooms delivering sentences, making decisions that affected people's lives. But this was something else. He wasn't just presiding over fate anymore, he was in it. Tanner spoke first, his voice low and sharp. "They haven't moved yet. Could be they're waiting for us to make the first mistake." Eastwood nodded. "Pierce's men don't rush, they calculate, they study, then they strike." Willis swallowed hard. "So what the hell do we do?" Eastwood glanced at him, his voice calm. "We make sure they regret showing up." Tanner chuckled dryly. "Still got that cowboy attitude, huh?" East smirked, but didn't respond. He turned back to the window, watching. The men outside were moving now, slow, methodical, black combat gear, suppressed weapons, no markings. Tanner muttered, "Professionals." Eastwood exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, but that doesn't mean they're better than us." Tanner tightened his grip on the shotgun. "Hope you're right, Clint, because we're about to find out." A sudden thud against the front door made Willis flinch. It wasn't a knock, it was a test, checking to see if the door was reinforced. Then from outside, a deep voice, "Eastwood, we know you're in there. Leighton, not make this messy." Willis felt a chill run down his spine. The voice was calm, too calm. Eastwood didn't flinch. "They always say that before things get messy," he muttered. Tanner smirked. "Guess we should oblige them then, huh?" Before Willis could react, Tanner raised his shotgun and fired through the front window. The boom was deafening, in the small house glass shattered outward, and a sharp cry of pain followed the first hit. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted, suppressed rounds punching into the walls, tearing through furniture, kicking up dust and splinters. The quiet house was now a war zone. Eastwood moved fast, ducking low and returning fire with precise, controlled shots. One bullet found its mark. One of the men outside dropped with a strangled gasp. Willis hit the floor, covering his head. "Jesus Christ!" Tanner reloaded, grinning. "Welcome to the real world, Judge." Another round of shots slammed into the house, and Eastwood grabbed Willis by the collar, yanking him toward the back. "We can't stay pinned down here. Time to move." Willis stumbled after him, adrenaline flooding his system. "Where the hell are we going?" Out, Eastwood said simply. Tanner nodded, firing off another shot before following. "Yeah, before they send in something heavier." As if on cue, a loud metallic clank sounded outside. Tanner cursed. "Jar, nod." Eastwood moved faster than a man his age had any right to. He grabbed the judge and shoved him toward the back hallway. Just as an explosion ripped through the front of the house, the shock wave sent debris flying, knocking furniture over, blowing out the rest of the windows. Willis hit the ground hard, his ears ringing. For a moment, everything was just noise and chaos. Then Eastwood's voice cut through it. "Up, Judge, we not dead." Yet Willis forced himself to his feet, his legs unsteady. "Jesus, they serious?" Tanner dusted himself off, coughing. "Yeah." "No." Eastwood reloaded. "Time to go. We take the back exit." Willis hesitated. "And go where?" Eastwood gave him a look. "Anywhere. But here they burst through the back door, moving fast. The alley behind the house was empty for now, but that wouldn't last. Eastwood led the way, cutting through narrow passageways, his instincts guiding him. Tanner followed, shotgun still raised. Willis stumbled behind them, his breath coming in gasps. You two do this often? Tanner chuckled. More. Then we'd like a sudden shout behind them. They running, more gunfire, bullets cracked past them, ricocheting off brick and metal. Eastwood spun, took two quick shots. One of their pursuers went down, the other dove for cover. Keep moving. They cut through another alley, then another. The city streets were still mostly empty, too early for people to be out, too late for anyone to notice what was happening in the shadows. Finally, Eastwood spotted what he was looking for, an old beat-up sedan parked near a side street. He yanked the door handle, locked. Tanner stepped forward, pulled a knife from his belt, and popped the lock in seconds. Old habits die hard, he muttered. Eastwood slid into the driver's seat. Get in. Willis hesitated. You steal cars too? Tanner laughed. Judge, I think you're starting to get it. Willis muttered something under his breath, but climbed in anyway. At this point, arguing seemed pointless. Eastwood started the car, just as more figures appeared at the far end of the alley. Hold on, he floored the gas. The sedan lurched forward, tires screeching as they peeled away. Gunshots followed, but the car was already disappearing into the early morning haze. They didn't stop until they reached the outskirts of the city, pulling onto an abandoned dirt road. Eastwood finally slowed the car, exhaling. Tanner leaned back in his seat. Well, that was fun. Willis glared at him. Fun? I nearly got my damn head blown off. Tanner grinned. Welcome to the club, Your Honor. Eastwood turned in his seat. Tanner, we need answers now. Tanner nodded, rubbing his temple. Yeah, I get it. Look, if Pierce is making moves, then we need to figure out what he's after. And I have a feeling I know where to start. Willis frowned, where Tanner took a breath. There's a name, someone who might know what Pierce is planning. Eastwood's eyes narrowed. Who? Tanner hesitated, then spoke a name that sent a chill through the air. Victor Langley. Willis looked between them. Who the hell is Victor Langley? Tanner's face darkened. He was our handler back when Blackthorn was still in the shadows. Eastwood's expression hardened. And if he's still alive, he's the only one who can tell us what Pierce is really after. The judge exhaled sharply. Great, another ghost from the past. Tanner smirked. You're catching on, Judge. Eastwood started the car again. Then Leighton, go find him. The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. The dirt road stretched ahead, swallowed by the early morning mist. The stolen sedan rumbled along the uneven terrain, its old engine groaning with every bump. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the silence between the three men heavy with unspoken thoughts. Clint Eastwood sat behind the wheel, his grip steady, his gaze fixed ahead. Judge Robert Willis sat in the passenger seat, still struggling to process the night's events, while Joseph Tanner sat in the back, his shotgun resting against his knee. Willis finally broke the silence. Victor Langley, you said he was your handler. That means he was what your boss? Tanner chuckled dryly. Boss? No, Langley wasn't the kind of man who gave orders. He was the kind who made sure the job got done. No questions, no loose ends. Willis frowned. And now he's supposed to have the answers we need. Eastwood spoke for the first time in a while, his voice quiet but firm. If Langley's still alive, he knows more than anyone else. He was the only one who saw every piece of Blackthorn, the missions, the people, the fallout. If Pierce is trying to rebuild it, Langley's the key. Willis exhaled, rubbing his temples. So, where do we even find him? Tanner pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket and tossed it into Willis's lap. That's his last known location, deep in the Arizona desert, outside a town nobody's ever heard of. Willis unfolded the paper, reading the name of the place, read Mesa, Arizona. The judge let out a dry chuckle. You mean to tell me we're driving to the middle of the desert to find a ghost? Eastwood smirked. Wouldn't be the first time. It took them most of the day to reach the Arizona border. The highways were long and empty, the kind of roads that seemed to stretch into nothingness. Red Mesa wasn't on most maps, and the deeper they drove into the desert, the more isolated the world around them became. By the time they reached the town, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dust-covered streets. Red Mesa wasn't much to look at, a collection of old buildings, a single gas station, a diner, and not much else. The kind of place where people kept to themselves and strangers weren't welcome. Tanner leaned forward, looking out the window. Langley always liked places like this, places where the past didn't exist. Eastwood pulled the car into the gas station parking lot, killing the engine. We start asking around. Someone here knows where he is. Willis frowned. And if he doesn't want to be found? Eastwood smirked. Then we make him want to be. The gas station was run by an old man who looked like he had been there since the place was built. He eyed them suspiciously as they walked in, his cigarette burning low in the corner of his mouth. Eastwood stepped up to the counter. We're looking for someone. Victor Langley. The old man exhaled a stream of smoke, barely reacting. Never heard of him. Tanner chuckled. See, that's funny, because we were told Hune's been living around here for a while. Now the old man's gaze flicked between them. Don't know what you're talking about. Willis, standing behind them, could see it. The lie. The man knew something. He was hiding it. Eastwood sighed. Listen, friend, we're not here to cause Trouble, we just need to talk to him. The old man studied them for a long moment, then finally muttered, "Try the diner. You didn't hear that from me." Eastwood nodded, much appreciated. As they walked back outside, Willis shook his head. "You really think he's going to be sitting in a diner?" Tanner smirked. "If I knew where I was, I'd be watching my back from the safest place in town, and that's usually where the coffee's hot and the exits are clear." The Red Mesa Diner was a relic from another time. Old neon sign buzzing, faintly cracked leather booths, the smell of burnt coffee hanging in the air. The place was nearly empty save for a waitress wiping down the counter and a single man sitting in the back corner. Willis knew even before Eastwood and Tanner started walking toward him that they had found Langley. The man was older than they remembered. His once black hair was now mostly gray, his face deeply lined. He wore a simple flannel shirt and jeans, blending in with the locals. But his eyes, his sharp, calculating eyes, hadn't changed a bit. He didn't look surprised to see them. He just sighed and took a sip of his coffee. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Eastwood slid into the booth across from him, Tanner taking the seat next to him. Willis hesitated for a moment before sitting beside Eastwood. Langley set his cup down and exhaled. "You always were too stubborn to stay dead." Clint Eastwood smirked. "I could say the same about you." Langley chuckled, shaking his head. "Guess we're both ghosts now." Tanner leaned forward. "We need answers." Langley Pierce is making moves. Hune hunting us." Langley's expression darkened. He glanced toward the waitress, then back at them. "Not here." Eastwood not Ed. Then where Langley stood, tossing a few bills on the table. "Follow me." Langley led them behind the diner down a dirt path that led to a small trailer sitting on the edge of town. He opened the door and stepped inside, motioning for them to follow. The inside was small, but clean, filled with old maps, files, and a single rifle leaning against the wall. Langley sat down heavily in a chair, rubbing his temples. "So he said you want to know what Pierce is up to?" Eastwood nodded. "We need to know how far Hune's willing to go." Langley exhaled. "Pierce isn't just cleaning up Blackthorn's past, rebuilding it." Willis frowned. "I thought Blackthorn was buried."